May we now move on, please, to the next item, which is the item 6, the NHS Performance Report. Barbara, you're going to outline this for us, I think.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. And this is the the third part of the 3 simple bits to commissioning, because this is how we bring to the board a monitoring of how we're doing. We generally do, this is a new and simpler report for the board, or simpler in terms of hopefully structure and the way it's laid out. We look at 2 aspects. We look at NHS performance, and we always look at that first, because in the final analysis that's what patients experience, and that's what really matters to us. And then we look at the NHS England business plan and how we're doing against some of those commitments. The third part of this report is the risks on the assurance framework. So if I can start with the NHS performance, and again, I won't repeat what the Chief Executive said about our concerns about some of the targets for making sure that patients are seen quickly, and what we're doing about urgent care in order to support the A&E standard, which gives us a good indication of the pressure in the system and whether patients are being seen in a timely manner, or the 18-week treatment, all of which are mentioned here. I do think it would be worth just pointing out to the board that we are concerned at the moment about diagnostics and the patients who've waited longer than 6 weeks. It's always seemed to me, particularly in the years when I had much more involvement with patients as a GP, that actually the thing which concerned them most was when they didn't have a diagnosis. You know, when you have a diagnosis, particularly if the diagnosis isn't a life-threatening disorder, then waiting to be treated is not quite as difficult as actually waiting to find out what's the matter with you, which I think is the worst thing to have to do. So the times that patients are waiting for diagnosis is just beginning to slip, and therefore we're doing a lot of work with TDA and monitoring our frontline organisations on why that's happening, and particularly around the cancer targets, because whilst most of those are fine, our worry is particularly about the 62-day wait, which is one of the really important targets. So again, we need to get this back online. We need to make sure that the system resilience groups, with this additional money that they have, not only do we find a way through that and through their work to improve the referral to treatment, the 18 weeks and the A&E, but particularly on cancer and diagnostics. The report then goes on the next 2 or 3 couple of pages to talk about our major mandate commitments. Again, things that are really important to patients, like being diagnosed for dementia, what's happening in Winterbourne View, and other national directors lead on the central and policy parts of this programme. But just to assure the board that working through the regional and area teams, every single one of these gets our attention in the Commissioning Operations Directorate in our regular meetings, and both regional and area directors working with their teams are working very hard to make sure that all these important things are delivered for patients. So that was the first thing on the NHS. If I can just draw the board's attention to, in terms of our business plan, you'll see from the paper that 3 of the areas in our business plan where we have concerns have very significant overlap: elective care, urgent care, and the challenge geographies, which is the work we're doing with those geographies where we've identified they have the biggest difficulty in delivering high quality, timely services for patients. The other 2 is a worry is about, again, this is from our central work, not about what's happening in the NHS, is the work plan on parity of esteem, where it's being refreshed and governance arrangements are being put in place, and medical revalidation. And again, I don't know if other national directors want to contribute on that. But I will just finish by identifying to the board in the board assurance framework that there are 2 risks that we've decided are now of a lower, have reduced in order that they don't necessarily need to be brought at corporate level. The first one is complaints. As you remember, this is a really essential service for patients that their complaints are addressed, but we had a big problem early on in NHS England with the numbers and the way we delivered the service, and because we've managed to address some of those, we think that this is now still an issue for us, still something that we're being very vigilant about, but not necessarily to be significant enough to be reported at this level. And similarly with 111, the performance of 111, we've had a slight dip recently, but it is only a slight dip compared to the issues we had a year or so ago. The performance issues are now largely managed, and we feel that this is part of the urgent care system and should be reported as one of the areas we need to get right in order to make the whole of urgent care and access to that urgent care and hospitals meeting the targets what it should be. 3 risks are going on to the BAF: genomics, the Better Care Fund, which we've talked about already, so I won't go on that, and referral to treatment time. And that's going on for a couple of reasons, really. One is because we've seen it deteriorate, but secondly, in a way, we'd almost squeezed referral to treatment time into the emergency care risk. It had been sort of that emergency care rises and it has a knock-on effect, which of course is true, it does, but we felt that it was important. Referral to treatment was significant enough for patients that it should be a separate risk. So the BAF shows those changes to the register, and obviously on the BAF summary on page 5 you'll just see that the majority of BAF risks haven't moved, with a couple of movements, but one is in 111, which we're saying is coming off the register anyway.
Thank you, Barbara. Comments, observations? Margaret?
Thank you, Barbara. It's very much simpler. It's very clear. Just at one point, in connection with NHS 111, if we are looking at the performance against the service level, there's still quite a gap against the target for responses within the targeted period, I think, which is 60 seconds. I think that we're quite a significant element below target, and you've noted that as amber, but it's amber to red in my view, if that's, with that sort of gap.
Yeah, I accept that. I mean, it is, I mean, obviously we want to make sure that every call is answered in that time. Compared to the problems that we had when this service was initiated, this is still the vast majority of patients still get their calls answered within that time. But we need to make it better. And it is 1 or 2 providers, whereas again last year we've seen problems across the board with the whole service. But we're working very, very closely with those providers, or our CCG colleagues are, to make sure that we get that target back online, and particularly the abandonment rate. That's really important, because that suggests that patients are giving up. There's always some abandonment. That will never be 0, because for a variety of reasons patients themselves change their minds. But we need to watch that, really important, because that's absolutely that's an outcome for me rather than a process measure.
Thank you.
Good. Right. Thank you. And thank you, Barbara, for the new model of report, which I think is appreciated by the board. May we move on then to paper 7, primary care co-commissioning. I'm going to invite Simon to say a few words about co-commissioning and the background to the paper.
Yes, thank you, Malcolm. So 2 months ago, we put on the table a new option for CCGs who wanted to come forward and propose ways in which they could get more control over the way primary medical services in their areas were funded and designed. And the context for this, obviously, is that we know that given the changing needs of the people we're serving, given the increasing numbers of older people with frailty and multiple long-term conditions, we need much greater integration. We need to overcome the funding silos that have historically existed between GP services, between community nursing services, between hospital outpatient services, ambulance services, social services. And so as a first step in this direction, what we have done is say we are willing to work with CCGs who want to either do this on our behalf or do this with us. And we have been very pleased by the enthusiasm that this opportunity that NHS England has offered has been greeted with. So 9 in 10 CCGs across the country, as the paper sets out, have come forward with a variety of proposals as to how they might work with us on this. We propose taking a permissive approach. Doesn't have to be the same everywhere, but obviously there needs to be very strong governance oversight to ensure that particularly For the third of the options with the greatest level of CCG control, there is a clear mechanism that a committee of this board can be confident in terms of ensuring conflicts of interest are dealt with. But we cannot let that issue stand in the way of the broader service changes which we know that patients need. So I'm going to ask Barbara to run through some of the detail in terms of how we propose assessing those individual applications and then the assurance and approval process that we would embark on. But I think the headline is here that frankly we are pushing at an open door in that, or rather CCGs are pushing at an open door, our open door, because what they want and what we want is one and the same.
Barbara.
Okay, thank you. And just to expand on the benefits for patients and why we think co-commissioning and having CCGs having much greater say in primary medical care services. The paper says primary care, it should say primary medical care, although it does explain in the paper that we can't delegate the other aspects. For explanation, the vast majority of care in the community, not district nurses, but doctors and GPs and dentists and opticians and pharmacists are called independent contractors, and that's all primary care contractors. And we tend sometimes to just use the term primary care when we mean the GP bit, and actually we need to be very clear that primary care does include all those other vital services as well. But what we do know is that GP services are so local, and it's so important that they serve the needs of patients within their communities. Often general practice has had a many years of relationship with the community. It's a very stable part of the NHS and a very personal relationship for patients. And it's always seemed that it was inappropriate that the commissioning of those services, for obvious reasons, and in order to allow CCGs to become mature and the governing bodies to bed in, and the worries about conflict of interest, but that those services should be commissioned by NHS England, which, despite the sterling efforts of its area teams, doesn't have anywhere like the same local presence that our CCGs do. And of course our CCGs are membership organisations of general practice, hence the issue about conflict of interest, but we shouldn't underestimate that gives them an intimate relationship with their patient. Many of them have lively patient participation groups and can start to understand what their patients' needs. The CCGs have a very local presence with stakeholders, local authority and social care, which can all be brought to bear in designing the services. The other reason is the kind of continuity, because patients, you know, they just have a set of care needs, and what we have at the moment is a situation whereby that absolutely vital first contact, you know, we shouldn't underestimate how much patient contact sits within the whole of primary care contracting, including optometrists and dentists and pharmacists, but also in general practice, how much of that patient contact starts and ends there, even though the patients then have services in the community and within hospitals. And actually to have a scenario where one group of people is commissioning that primary care, and yet another group of people is commissioning the community services, and another group of people is commissioning the hospital services. And, you know, perhaps just to give an example of a patient with a long-term condition, perhaps somebody who has heart failure, or somebody who has a chronic lung disorder, that patient will have a very close relationship with their general practitioner, but also often with many of the other staff in the general practice. A lot of practices have a practice nurse. They might have a specialist heart failure nurse who might be employed by the practice, or they might be employed by the community nurses, and those patients will also have a very intimate relationship with the community nursing staff. They're commissioned by the CCG. Many of them will go to the hospital for services. That's commissioned by the GP. Some of them may have specialist needs, which we will commission. But for the most important specialised services, it's a smaller subset. But for the vast majority of patients who are frail, who are elderly, or have any sort of long-term condition, they need a joined-up approach across all that care. And therefore, what this is designed to do is make sure that either through joint commissioning or through the delegation of budgets, we can start to see that focus on that patient who needs services from the GP, from out of hours, from community services and from the hospital to be seamless and joined up. So this paper kind of, first of all, identifies some of the things that we we expect to see delivered as benefits, some of which I've just explained, but others I think include closer working with social care because of the local nature, but also raising the standards of quality. CCGs do have a responsibility to improve the quality of primary care, but they will say that to some extent they don't have some of the levers because they don't commission, and we shouldn't underestimate how much quality is risen by peer pressure and people working together across groups of practices. But also the local understanding of local needs and very specific local communities. A lot of our CCGs say that they could do more to tackle inequalities if they had that focus because of their local need and understanding. So as Simon said, encouragingly, we had very significant numbers of expressions of interest. And we determined when we were identifying how we would support CCGs through the process that the expressions of interest would broadly fall into three categories, or were broadly falling into three categories. Those where the CCGs just said, we'd really like more influence, we'd like to be able to work more closely with the area teams. Of the 196, only 15 CCGs don't want to do co-commissioning, 196 do. Of the 196 that want to do, the category of influence, there are only 19 in that category. The biggest category is 110, where 110 CCGs want to do joint commissioning, which means that they would have a joint committee with our area team, and they'd all work together on the commission of primary care. And 74 want to take delegated authority for some aspects of primary medical care commissioning. Two things that we need to work on over the coming months, and there is a lot of work to do to ensure that what we do is the right thing to do, is permissive, but actually protects both the patients in terms of the quality of services and protects the taxpayer vis-a-vis any conflict of interest. So we need to get all the work done around the joint committees and identify exactly how they will work, and that will be going through the system, coming through, and the CCG Oversight Committee, the Assurance Committee will be ensuring that those processes are right. We'll be producing templates, because actually what we don't want is the wheel to be reinvented many times across the country on the joint committees. But we will be looking particularly at those expressions of interest which include delegated authority, because that's the one where Chief Executive rightly pointed out that we have to be very vigilant about conflict of interest. I think times have changed enormously over the last year or so. CCGs, which were immature organisations, are now robust statutory organisations. They have their governing bodies, they've got a lot of patient and public participation and a lot of members on the governing bodies who aren't GPs. But we will need to test every single one of those and make sure that where they are making decisions about GP service, those conflicts of interests are covered. Now, we've already, in the early days of CCGs, we produced guidance which was very clear about what they had to do, because they could have had issues of conflict of interest before co-commissioning. So they should already have in place arrangements whereby GPs who have any interest declare it, as we do here, and stand aside from any discussions or decisions that are to be made. That there's they have arrangements for adequate patient and public voice through lay members. They're similar. They're not called non-executives, but they're similar to non-executive members, and that where necessary, decisions can be made where the majority of people making the decisions are not the GPs, if they all have an interest, and on occasions whereby the CCG can actually defer the decision to either another CCG if really too many of the members of the governing body are conflicted, or to check and get double assurance from our area team that the decision that they've made is appropriate, and as well as encouraging them to use the right contracting models, so making sure that they use open and competitive tendering where that would be appropriate for some of these services. Those are the sort of oversight arrangements that we'll be putting in place. So lots of work to do as we go through the next few months, but just we have asked our area teams to give us an assessment of how what categories we think these expressions of interest fall into, in terms of which ones are ready now, which ones they think will be ready quite soon, and which ones will be ready later. encouragingly, the vast majority are in the ready now or ready soon, and very specifically out of the delegated authority, where there are 74, if you will remember, we think that 20, the area team's early assessment is that about 20 would be ready now, that 45 would be ready soon, and only 9 would be ready later. And you know, if you working on the assumption that obviously that's the category we would have expected the greatest delay, it does show us the preponderance that these plans coming forward are realistic and have been assessed as the ones that we would be in a position to support.
Barbara, thank you, and thank you for that picture of the energy that's coming from the CCGs and those who are interested in Category C. Let me invite comments from colleagues.
Just a small comment you made around the potential for this to move workforce and have roles which combine some of the specialist commissioning, type of commissioning we do with what CCGs do in primary care. I think that's probably much more important than we really realise. So I think it was just good to hear it, I suppose, is as much as I want to say.
Yeah, I mean, maybe since the point about specialised commissioning there as well, Kieran, direction of travel is clearly we want to have, to the greatest possible extent, unified population-based budgets that include primary care, local hospital and community services, and specialised commissioning services. So as we have been doing the review of the scope of specialised commissioning, and have been looking at whether now that CCGs are up and running, firing all cylinders, there's an opportunity for them to take more control, give more direction to some of what's in the specialised commissioning pot. I think we will be coming back to you in September or October with proposals for greater devolution of parts of the specialist commissioning responsibilities as well, either to CCGs individually or collectively, and we'll be thinking about how that in turn maps onto an allocation process.
And it links into social care and special care fund and whatever as well. So
it does, and as you know, one of the things that I'm going to be doing next week is setting out a new option for commissioning jointly with Health and Social Care at the LGA conference.
Okay. Thank you. Moira?
Thank you, Malcolm. Barbara gave a very clear presentation really about the potential benefits but the risks. Just so as a detail point, will the committees in common meet in public?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure that I know the answer. Ros, have we done anything on that, or is that something we need to look at?
No, I think it's something we need to look at, and what we know is that CCGs are holding many of their meetings in public, so I think it does give a really good opportunity to have some of these local decisions about primary care being made with public voice there.
Yeah, most certainly. If it was as a joint committee, it would, like all our joint committees do, need to report its actions and give an overview to the CCG governing body. So I kind of guess it would depend on the depth of detail of what that committee would do, but it will give us, where patients have said to us, where's the local voice of how the commissioning NHS England does? And if they meet in common, it will mean that the same way as we would do here, locally, the CCG governing bodies, all of which do meet in public, would need to report what their committees had been talking about and decided.
Good, thank you. Well, good progress. I think the whole idea of having population-based commissioning on a local basis with delegation from us, but with appropriate oversight to assure against any inference of conflict of interest is going to be critically important, because that then stabilises the system. So we look to the executive team to continue to work on this. Thank you for the report.